All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing okay. Today, we're just going to go briefly through this one of the specific components of exposure in photography, and that is shutter speed. You might recognize some of these slides from our previous lectures, so I just want to reiterate a little bit about shutter speed specifically and how you can use it to achieve different effects in your photographic images, and how we use it to as one of the three components of exposure and how to balance those things. So when we ask what shutter speed is in photography, what we're really referring to is the time. The amount of time, or the time in which a camera's sensor or film is exposed to light, right? Exposure time is a way that we refer to that. And we measure that time usually in the fractions of seconds, right? Light moves very fast, and so we can accrue a lot of light in exposure in a very short amount of time. So usually when we're talking about exposure times or shutter speeds, we're talking about fractions of seconds. And we learned about that earlier in our last module, in which we learned about our shutter speed settings in certain types of stops, like a half a second, or 1/125th of a second, or 1/500th of a second. So exposure time is measured in fractions of seconds, and very rarely in whole seconds in photography. And shutter speed, again, is one of the three components of exposure in photography, right? We have shutter speed, the amount of time in which we let light in to our camera, right? When we click the shutter, release, the shutter opens, letting light in to hit our sensor or film, and then it closes again. It's like a door opening and closing. We have our aperture, right? That's the size of our hole, and we set that aperture size with our f-stops. And again, to reiterate, a larger f-stop number like 1.4 or 2 or 2.8, that's a bigger hole. And a smaller f-stop number like f16 or f22 is a smaller hole, right? And the bigger the hole, the more light, the smaller the hole, the less light, right? And lastly, our ISO, which is our film sensitivity, right? We can set that with our digital cameras. We have the ability to set how sensitive our sensor is. So if our sensor is really sensitive to light, we might not need to let in as much light with these other two because we're so sensitive. So when we look at an image like this, right, at first it kind of looks fake, but it's not. It's actually an image taken by a photographer in Europe, and it is a real single photograph that was taken in one shot over a long period of time. And the shutter speed was so slow that all the lights were allowed to change during that time. So maybe many minutes of exposure, right? And usually we're shooting on regular sunny days, we're shooting really fast shutter speeds, like maybe 1/200th of a second, just a tiny fraction of a second. But for an image like this, the way that we could achieve something like this is to set our cameras on a tripod so we don't get anything blurry, and we just open up the shutter for a really long time, right? We set our shutter really open, really slow, and this is what will happen, right? Allowing enough time to pass for weird things to go into our image. Here's another good example of a photograph that was taken down by where I'm from in Florida, and this is an image of a Falcon 9 rocket launch on the east coast of Florida. And again, the camera is on a tripod, so anything that's still and not moving is sharp, right? So if you look at the sand down here, it's nice and sharp. Or this person sitting still, sharp. This kind of lifeguard stand, it's not moving, so it's nice and sharp and crisp. But these kids that are standing here, they're alive and they're moving, so they start to blur. The clouds in the sky, they're going by. So the amount of time that the shutter was open allowed the clouds to move a little bit, causing this blur. And of course, right, the real subject of the image is this Falcon 9 rocket and its many stages happening, and we can see that as it goes up into the atmosphere, leaving a trail across our image. Our shutter was open long enough for that entire path to be recorded in light. Okay. The long shutter speed photography, as we refer to it as, is really fun, and you definitely need to have a tripod for these kinds of things. The camera has to be still, right? Because again, anything that moves will be blurry, and if your camera moves while your shutter speed is open, right, everything it sees will have moved. It'll be blurry. So remember that. For really long exposures, we really want to stabilize our cameras. On the opposite end of that spectrum, right, is really fast shutter speed. So if we're using our camera at maybe like 1/1000th of a second or even faster, we can capture things frozen in time almost. Here we have an extremely fast shutter speed of a bullet going through an apple, right? So high speed flashes that were needed to assist in the adding enough light for the shutter speed to be fast enough to capture this. Here's another great example of an extremely fast shutter speed in which someone holding a water balloon pops the water balloon, and right as the rubber kind of recoils back over itself, we still have a shape of the water in the balloon before it goes everywhere. So an extremely fast shutter speed, freezing motion, right? The opposite of slow shutter speeds. Now I will say that when we're dealing with extremely fast shutter speeds, right? Shutter speeds that can freeze motion because we're just capturing a tiny sliver of time, you do need to remember that you need to have enough light in order to be able to do that, right? Because you're capturing such a tiny fraction of time, only a tiny amount of light is going to enter your camera, right? Even if your aperture is wide open. So you need to have enough light to capture really high speed images, right? So remember that. It's always a balance. Take a second and think what kind of shutter speed was used to capture this waterfall image. And if you thought to yourself, a longer exposure, then you're right. And the reason we might know that is because while all of this plant matter and this rock wall are really nice and sharp and crisp and in focus, we have our waterfall. It's all blurry like a wispy ghost. And then here where it hits the water, it's kind of fanning out in this beautiful blurry gradient. Right? So again, a longer shutter speed, camera was definitely on a tripod, maybe a 30-second exposure, something like that. Here's another one. Now this one's kind of tricky. Now, with an image like this, right, we would think maybe that we had a slow shutter speed, and in fact you would be right, because this person who's spinning this sort of light staff, right, is there's enough shutter speed time to allow that staff to spin around her as she's moving and capture all of that movement. However, because there's also a flash going off on the right hand side of the image, I had a friend of mine holding a flash in his hand, and as she was spinning this, I had a long exposure. But then at the very end of that exposure, a flash went off, allowing whatever was lit in that moment of the exposure to be bright and sharp. So it was a dark image, and the only thing that you could really see was this spinning light. But then as soon as that flash goes off in part of that long exposure, the flash was only entering the image for a second. And so whatever was being lit in that 1 second over the course of that long exposure appears sharp. So it's sort of like getting two effects in one. And I would encourage you to try it sometime. So again, we must remember that we're measuring shutter speed in fractions of seconds, right? 1 second is a lot of time in photography. It lets in a lot of light. You'd have to have a tripod to do something like that without getting a blurry image because you're going to be shaking your camera over 1 second. And we have to remember that the longer the duration of our shutter speed, the more time, the more light is coming into our camera, right? And as we reduce that fraction of seconds all the way down to things like 1/1000th of a second, we're letting in less light, less time, but our image will be sharper, right? We'll have this more crispy image and motion will be frozen. And there's a video in this module that I want you guys to look at by the slow-mo guys, and they sort of explain what shutter speed looks like inside your camera, which is really fun. But here, I can show you that one of the ways shutter speed is controlled by your camera is this window comes down from the top to the bottom of your sensor. And depending on how fast you want your shutter speed to be, the window is actually just a little bit bigger and it moves down to result in less or more time that the shutter or the sensor is exposed to light. So make sure you watch that video, it's a lot of fun. Now, as you guys are learning exposure in the last module and going forward, you should be looking through your camera's viewfinder when you're shooting, right? And you should be setting your aperture, shutter speed, and sometimes your ISO by using the dials and setting buttons on your camera, but you can do that while you're looking through your camera's viewfinder, right? I went through this in one of the videos in the last module photography through my viewfinder, so please go and refresh that in your mind if you need to. But when you look through your camera's viewfinder and you see the green numbers and letters at the bottom of that viewfinder when you prime your camera's system by clicking the shutter down halfway, you'll see all these numbers, right? And here's your light meter, right? This is the little thing that tells you whether the settings you've chosen are going to let in enough light, too much light, or not enough light, okay? And again, there's a lot of information down here, but the things that you need to pay attention to are where your shutter speed is, right? It's going to be here, aperture here, your light meter, and then your ISO, and then somewhere on the right should be the number of exposures you have left, so how much room is on your card, right? And for a lot of you, batteries and things like flash will be there as well. So make sure that you're using this, okay? Make sure that you are setting your shutter speed with your dials as you're looking through your camera's viewfinder so that you can see this light meter change, right? Again, if you've chosen aperture and shutter speed settings that are letting in too much light for the scene that you're photographing, your meter will move this little thing to say that you've set it to have too much light. If it's in the +1, +2 area, then you've let in too much light. And if it's in the -1 or -2, you're not letting enough light in, right? We're trying to zero out our meters so that we have a good, well-balanced exposure. Okay, so this is a nice way to just think of that. In the minus, darker, in the plus, brighter. All right, and our correct exposure is right in the middle. So you should be trying to get a good correct exposure for the settings that you want. So here's an example of what our meter looks like when we have a correct exposure for the scene, right? So maybe we're outside photographing something on a cloudy day. We have our ISO set to 200 and our shutter speed was 1/125th of a second. So this number is actually a fraction representation, right? So it's 1/125. So that's 1/125th of a second, really fast shutter speed at f16, okay? Shutter speed, aperture, ISO, light meter, okay? So this is what a correct exposure would look like. And then maybe for that scene, if we changed our f-stop from 16 to 11, that means we opened up our aperture, so we let in more light through a bigger hole. So now we're overexposed, okay? And if we closed it down to something like f22, right, that's much smaller than f16, now we're not letting enough light in, so it goes into the minus, okay? So this is sort of using your light meter in your viewfinder. Now, in our last module, I talked about equivalent exposures, and you guys did a good job. Most of you posted great examples of equivalent exposures, right? And that's using different combinations of shutter speed and aperture to produce the same brightness of an image. And the reason that we want to learn how to do this is for this example specifically, okay? So here on the left, we have a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second at f5.6, okay? That's kind of sort of in the middle on the larger side of an aperture opening, and a 60th of a second is pretty fast, fast enough maybe to freeze some basic motion, right? And we have a nice outdoor sunny day, ISO of 400, okay? And so this is an example of an image where we have our settings set and our light meter says we're good and we've made a good exposure and everything looks nice. It's not too bright, not too dark, so our settings are good. But let's say that we wanted to create movement in that image, right? And we wanted to allow, this beach's surf to blur a little bit, create some drama. Okay, well, we would slow our shutter speed down, right? Like the images that we just saw, if we have a slower shutter speed, the increased amount of time that our shutter is open allows things that are moving to blur, creating beautiful effects. So if you look over here, now we have a shutter speed of 1/2 of a second, right? That's a really long time. So we put our camera on a tripod and take that exposure. But when we're metering for that exposure, a 1/2 a second is a lot more light than 1/60th of a second, right? So what we've had to do is, in order to create the equivalent exposure brightness, we've had to close down our f-stop to 32 from f5.6. f5.6 is a much larger hole, letting in much more light. f32 is a tiny hole, letting in very little light. That's what we had to do to balance our exposure for this increased amount of time, right? So because we went from a really fast shutter speed, a fraction of a second, to almost a whole second of shutter speed time, letting in much more light, we had to close down our f-stop all the way from 5.6 to 32, letting in much less light to compensate for that increased time. Okay, and of course our ISO stayed the same. Now, the result is the same image brightness, right? The images are pretty much equivalent when it comes to brightness, so they look well exposed. The difference being that because we chose shutter speed over our aperture in order to change it to get this effect, now we have these really beautiful blurs that are happening along the beach, and we've achieved a well-balanced exposure by closing down our aperture to compensate. So I hope that that makes sense. If any of you are having problems with that, I do want you to reach out to me, and we can chat on our class module chat so that we can sort of clarify that for you, because this is a really important concept of learning how to balance your light meters and get equivalent exposures kind of right in your mind in order to be able to achieve the creative results in our settings, in our exposure settings. So please let me know if you need any help with that. So for the rest of this module, I have a reading for you and some other activities that'll sort of help you experiment with long exposure and shutter speed. So just remember to have fun, and that shutter speed allows us to capture light in motion. It's a good way to think of it. And here is another great example of the great Pablo Picasso using photography to draw with a flashlight. So this is him with a long exposure, drawing with a flashlight while his camera is open with a long shutter speed on a tripod. And you guys might have seen something like this before. It's called light writing or light painting. So you'll get a chance to do that in the future. All right, good luck with the rest of the module. It's a short one, and yeah, have fun. Good luck.